I got close to the bottom.
720.
40 dopes.
My sketchy it does.
Okay.
You're not clear.
5:30 a.m. November 12, 2010, high in the mountains of Afghanistan's Kunar province, Taliban fighters have opened fire from the cliffs above, trapping coalition forces deep inside a narrow valley. Every ridgeline seems alive with enemy gunfire. Helicopters are being called in, airstrikes are pounding the mountains above, and now Army Ranger sniper teams are moving into position to stop the Taliban fighters from overrunning the Americans below. The surviving American troops below later reported that the Ranger sniper teams were like angels of death, because from their position they could not see the Army Rangers. All they could see were dead Taliban fighters rolling down the mountainside. The mountains rose thousands of feet above the narrow valley floor. Jagged rock formations overlooked every trail, every village, every approach route. It was the perfect terrain for an ambush. Coalition forces had entered the region to strike Taliban strongholds that had long served as safe havens for insurgent fighters moving across the nearby border. The mission seemed straightforward on paper: move into the valley, clear enemy positions, destroy Taliban fighting networks, then withdraw. But the Taliban had spent years preparing for this moment. Fighters occupied caves, fighting positions, and hidden bunkers carved into the mountainsides. Machine guns were zeroed in on likely avenues of approach. Spotters watched from the peaks, waiting for American troops to enter the kill zone. As coalition forces advanced deeper into the valley, Ranger sniper teams moved onto the high ground. Their job was simple: find the enemy before the enemy found everyone else. For hours, the snipers scanned the mountains through their powerful optics. At first, nothing moved. Then one sniper spotted something unusual: a brief flash of sunlight reflecting from metal high on a ridgeline. A moment later, another flash appeared several hundred yards away. The Rangers had just spotted Taliban observers, and that meant the ambush was about to begin. The first shots came without warning. A burst of machine gun fire ripped across the valley floor, kicking up dirt and rock around the lead elements below. Then came another and another. Within seconds, the mountains erupted with gunfire. Taliban fighters hidden among the cliffs and boulders opened fire from multiple directions all at once. Tracer rounds streaked down the slopes while rifle fire echoed through the valley. The enemy had been waiting for them, and now the trap was closing in. American troops immediately dove for cover behind rocks and shallow depressions in the terrain. Radio traffic exploded as units began reporting contact from several positions at once. But the real problem wasn't the sheer number of the enemy's force, it was visibility. The Taliban weren't standing in the open. They were firing from concealed positions high above the valley, disappearing behind rocks long before the American troops could even identify where the shots were coming from. But the Ranger sniper teams on the high ground had a different view. From their elevated position, they could see movement the forces below couldn't. One sniper tracked a fighter sprinting between boulders nearly 1,000 yards away. Another identified a machine gun position firing down into the valley. The Rangers began relaying target locations over the radio: grid coordinates, distances, directions, anything that could help the troops below return fire. Then the snipers started engaging. Carefully controlled shots cracked across the mountainside. One enemy firing position went silent, then another. The Rangers weren't firing rapidly, they didn't need to. Every shot was deliberate, every shot was aimed at a fighter who was exposing himself for just a few seconds before trying to disappear back into cover. One by one, they dropped Taliban fighters, sending their bodies tumbling down the mountainside. If you want to see the uncensored footage from this video that was too graphic for YouTube, our Patreon page currently has a whopping 90% off sale, so now is the perfect time to join and access our full library of uncensored footage. But despite the Rangers' efforts, the Taliban kept pouring fire into the valley. More fighters appeared along the ridgeline. Some moved into new firing positions while others attempted to maneuver around the coalition forces to flank them. The battle was growing fast. Soon aircraft were being called in overhead. The sound of jet engines echoed through the mountains as coalition commanders realized this was no longer a small engagement. This was a major battle, and it was only going to get worse. As the Rangers scanned the ridgelines for new threats, one sniper spotted something that immediately changed the situation. A group of Taliban fighters were moving along a hidden trail high above the battlefield. They weren't heading toward the valley floor, they were moving to surround it. The enemy was trying to cut off the force below, and if they succeeded, dozens of Americans and Afghan troops could find themselves trapped in the mountains with hostile fighters closing in from all directions. The Rangers immediately transmitted the warning. Now the battle wasn't just about surviving the ambush, it was about stopping the encirclement before it was too late. The warning from the Rangers spread across the radio net quickly. Taliban fighters were maneuvering along the ridgelines. If they reached that destination, they could fire directly into coalition force from multiple directions and potentially cut off the only route out of the valley. Commanders knew they couldn't allow that to happen. The high ground had to be taken. Almost immediately, American and Afghan troops began pushing up the steep mountainside toward the enemy positions. It was absolutely brutal terrain. Loose rocks slid under their boots, sharp cliffs forced troops to climb hand over hand in some places. Every step uphill drained energy while the thin mountain air made breathing harder and harder. All the while, Taliban fighters continued firing on them from above. Machine guns rattled from hidden positions, rifle rounds snapped overhead, dust and fragments of rock exploded from the slopes as bullets struck around the advancing troops. The Rangers watched it all unfold through their optics. From their observation points, they could see enemy fighters attempting to reposition as coalition forces climbed toward them. The snipers immediately began directing fire onto the most dangerous positions. Several Taliban fighters were forced to abandon firing points and retreat behind the ridgeline. Others disappeared into caves and rock formations that had protected insurgents in these mountains for years. But the Taliban weren't retreating, they were just reinforcing. More fighters began appearing along the upper slopes. What had started as an ambush was turning into a sustained battle across multiple ridgelines. The mountains echoed with constant sound of gunfire, but then, just as coalition forces were nearing several key enemy positions, help arrived from above. Multiple American F-16 Fighting Falcons screamed overhead. Within moments, precision-guided bombs began striking Taliban positions identified by the troops on the ground. Massive explosions erupted across the mountainsides. Columns of dust and smoke climbed into the sky, and everyone in the valley below was showered with dust and debris. For a brief moment, the enemy fire began to weaken. Coalition troops seized the opportunity. They pushed harder up the slopes, closing the distance on positions that had been pouring fire into the valley for hours. The Rangers continued scanning for survivors and new threats. Then, one sniper spotted movement through the settling dust. Several Taliban fighters had somehow survived the strikes, and they were preparing for one final stand on a rocky ridgeline overlooking the entire battlefield. If that position remained in enemy hands, the fight could drag on for hours. The decision was made quickly. The Rangers and assault forces would move directly toward the ridgeline and finish the fight themselves. The most dangerous phase of codename Operation Bulldog Bite was about to begin. By now, the battle had been raging for hours. The valley below was scarred by explosions. Smoke drifted through the mountains, and the constant crack of gunfire echoed from ridge to ridge. But one problem still remained. A cluster of Taliban fighters still occupied a rocky ridgeline overlooking much of the battlefield. They had survived the airstrikes, they had survived repeated attacks, and they were still firing. As long as that position remained active, coalition forces moving through the valley would remain vulnerable. The order came down to take the ridgeline. American and Afghan troops began their final climb. The terrain was unforgiving. Large boulders and jagged rock formations created countless hiding places for defenders. Every few yards offered another place for a fighter to disappear and reappear somewhere else. The Rangers knew the enemy would fight hard here. This was their last major position, their last chance to hold the high ground. As the assault force climbed higher, Ranger sniper teams continued scanning ahead. One sniper spotted movement between two rock outcroppings. A Taliban fighter emerged briefly, weapon in hand, attempting to relocate to another firing position. The sniper dropped him immediately, and the Taliban fighter tumbled down the mountainside. Moments later, another enemy position was identified farther up the slope. Again, the Rangers directed fire and called out the target locations for the assault force below. Slowly but steadily, the coalition troops closed the distance. The Taliban responded with everything they had left. Machine guns opened up, rifle fire poured down the mountainside. Several fighters attempted to break contact and escape across the ridgeline, moving between rocks and shallow trenches that had been prepared long before the operation began. But there was nowhere left to go. Coalition forces were now attacking from multiple directions. Aircraft remained overhead, and the Rangers continued watching every avenue of escape. One by one, the enemy positions fell silent. Then finally, American and Afghan troops reached the crest of the ridgeline. The defenders who remained on top of the ridgeline either fled down the other side into the mountains or were gunned down where they stood by the advancing American force. For the first time all day, the gunfire began to fade. The high ground was secure. Operation Bulldog Bite had broken one of the Taliban's strongest positions in the region. But as the Rangers looked across the valley below, they could see just how intense the battle had been. The mountainsides were littered with destroyed firing positions, abandoned weapons, and the scars left by hours of combat. The fight was over, the mission was a success, but the men on that ridgeline knew they had just survived one of the most intense mountain battles of the war. As the sun began to set over Kunar province, a strange silence settled across the valley. The gunfire had stopped, the explosions were gone. For the first time all day, the mountains were quiet. American and Afghan troops stood atop the ridgelines they had fought so hard to capture, looking down over the battlefield that had nearly consumed them just hours earlier. The mission had been accomplished, the Taliban strongholds had been broken, the valley was no longer under enemy control. But victories like this are never measured by terrain alone, they are measured by the men who fought for it. Throughout Operation Bulldog Bite, American soldiers willingly climbed into some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. They advanced uphill against entrenched enemy fighters who held every advantage. They crossed exposed slopes under machine gun fire. They pushed forward when turning back would have been much easier. Again and again, they chose courage. The Ranger sniper teams who watched over the battlefield from the high ground helped identify threats before they could strike. Assault forces fought their way up the mountains that seemed impossible to climb. Air crews overhead answered call after call for support, placing themselves in harm's way to protect the troops on the ground. Every man and woman involved understood the risk, and yet every one of them continued the mission anyway. What stands out most about Operation Bulldog Bite isn't a single shot, a single explosion, or even a single act of heroism. It's the determination of ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things for the men and women beside them. No one wanted to be a hero that day. They simply refused to abandon their brothers. In the harsh mountains of eastern Afghanistan, surrounded by enemy fighters and facing overwhelming odds, they demonstrated the qualities that have defined the American fighting spirit for generations: courage, discipline, sacrifice, and the unwavering commitment to one another. Many of the battles fought during the war in Afghanistan will eventually fade from public memory, but the actions of the men and women who fought them deserve to be remembered. Because freedom has always depended on individuals willing to stand in harm's way on behalf of others. And on that day in the mountains of Kunar, a group of American soldiers did exactly that. Their names may not all be known, their stories may never all be told, but their courage echoes far beyond those ridgelines. And for that, they have earned the gratitude and respect of a nation. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. John 15:13. And to every ranger, soldier, airman, and ally who fought in Operation Bulldog Bite, thank you for your service, we remember your sacrifice, and we honor your courage. August 2nd, 2006, Ramadi, Iraq, a day where everything came down to seconds, and one Navy SEAL put himself on the line time and time again to save his brothers. They were clearing a block controlled by hardened insurgents, fighters who knew the terrain, the rooftops, the alleys, and who waited patiently until the Americans were trapped out in the open. And when the ambush hit, it hit like a hammer. A wounded teammate, a pinned down assault element, an enemy machine gunner locking the whole platoon in place. And one U.S. Navy SEAL, Mark Allen Lee, stepping out into the line of fire again and again, knowing exactly what he was risking and doing it anyway.
Behind that wall over there! Where at? To the east! To the east! 200 meters! 200 meters!
Before the chaos of Ramadi, there was Mark Allen Lee, not a legend yet, just a kid from Oregon with a stubborn backbone, a loud laugh, and a habit of stepping up when things got hard. He wasn't born into the teams, he fought his way there. A former soccer player, a fighter, a guy who pushed himself until every weakness cracked and fell away. Buds didn't break him, Hell Week didn't slow him down. He carved his place in SEAL Team 3 with grit, discipline, and a willingness to do miserable jobs without complaint. To the guys in his platoon, Mark wasn't the loudest or the flashiest. He was the steady one, rock solid under pressure, zero ego. A teammate you trusted because he never hesitated when it mattered. By 2006, he was a part of Task Unit Bruiser, one of the most effective, aggressive, and battle-proven special operations units fighting in Iraq. It was the legendary task unit led by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin, the same one grinding day after day in the most violent city in the world at the time. Mark wasn't there for glory, he was there because American soldiers and Marines were dying in that city every day, and the only way to change that was to fight street by street, rooftop by rooftop, block by block. In Ramadi, Mark had done it all. He carried a Mark 11 sniper rifle on Overwatch missions, he kicked down doors as a breacher, he ran point when the platoon needed someone to step into the unknown first. Whatever the job was, Mark took it, not because he had something to prove, but because it needed to be done. His teammates knew exactly who he was, a protector, a workhorse, a man who made everyone around him better. And on August 2nd, 2006, that reputation was tested in a way no one expected, inside the narrow, dust-choked streets of south-central Ramadi, where a fortified enemy cell had been waiting for a chance to kill Americans. Mark wasn't supposed to become the story of that day, but within minutes, his actions became the reason several of his brothers lived. Ramadi in the summer of 2006 wasn't just dangerous, it was a grinding, day-to-day fight for survival. IED craters cut through every street, burned out cars sat like rusted skeletons, and every alley, rooftop, and shadow was a possible firing position. Task Unit Bruiser operated here constantly, locking down neighborhoods so Army and Marine units could take and hold ground. It was slow, dangerous, and violent work. On August 2nd, the mission was straightforward on paper. Support an Army element clearing the J Block, a cluster of dense buildings where insurgent fighters had been slipping in and out, using the area to stage ambushes and mortar attacks. The Navy SEALs were there as a direct action support element, backing up the soldiers, taking rooftops, providing precision fire and being the hammer if something went wrong. Mark rolled out with his platoon in armored Humvees, moving southwest toward the target area. The convoy pushed through the tight streets, dust whipping through the open doors, radios crackling with movement updates. Even before they reached the block, everyone felt it. Overwhelming tension, the heaviness in the air, the kind that meant the enemy was close. The soldiers began clearing the first set of buildings while the Navy SEALs took up supporting positions around the perimeter. Mark moved in with the assault element, flowing through doorways and broken courtyards, eyes scanning every window frame. The enemy had fought hard here before. They'd fled, regrouped, and were itching for another fight. Inside the block, the environment tightened around them. Narrow stairwells, long hallways with blown out plaster, rooftops connected by shaky planks and exposed rebar. Exactly the kind of terrain an insurgent could use to pin down an entire platoon. But for a while, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The Army element called for the Navy SEALs to shift positions to support the next set of buildings, deeper into enemy territory. If you want to see the uncensored footage from this video that was too graphic to show here on YouTube, our Patreon page currently has a free trial you can claim right now, so you get full access to our entire archive of uncensored footage completely free. Link down below. This meant crossing open ground between structures, a dead space the insurgents had used before to trap American forces. Mark moved into position near a doorway on the south side of the block, guiding his teammates across the gap one by one. The last man stepped off, and that's when all hell broke loose. A burst of PKM fire echoed across the clearing, heavy caliber rounds slamming into the walls, kicking up dust, ripping into the doorway Mark was covering. The enemy had been waiting patiently. They'd set up the perfect kill zone, and the Americans had just walked straight into it. The first burst of PKM fire was so violent it shook the entire building. The sound was deafening, that deep, ripping thump of a belt-fed machine gun firing from close range. Rounds punched into the wall inches from Mark's head, showering him with dust and broken plaster. The enemy had perfect fields of fire, elevated position, pre-sighted angles. They had waited until the Americans were exposed, and now they were pouring fire directly into the choke point. The Army element across the courtyard hit the deck immediately, completely pinned down. Two soldiers were trapped behind a low wall, unable to move without being cut down. The Navy SEALs inside the building behind Mark couldn't push forward. The machine gun had them locked in place. If someone didn't break the ambush, they were going to start taking casualties fast. And as always, Mark didn't hesitate. He swung out into the doorway, leaning into the gunfire, and sent a burst of accurate fire toward the rooftop where the PKM was firing. He didn't have cover or concealment, just a splintered door frame and the will to stand in the line of fire. Enemy rounds cracked past his face. Chunks of concrete exploded all around him, but he held his ground. Thanks to Mark, his teammates inside the building were able to reposition deeper into the hallway, break the angle, and prepare to push out against the enemy. The PKM shifted its fire towards Mark, the insurgent gunner recognizing the biggest threat in the fight. But Mark didn't pull back. Instead, he stepped further into the doorway, deliberately exposing himself so the gunner would keep aiming at him instead of the soldiers pinned down out in the open. He put accurate rounds right on the enemy PKM nest, forcing the PKM team to duck for cover, just long enough for the two soldiers to sprint across the open ground into cover. That move saved their lives. But the ambushers didn't like that one bit. More enemy fighters appeared in the windows across the block, RPG teams shifting into position, muzzle flashes appearing in the darkened rooms. The insurgents were trying to collapse the entire American formation by overwhelming them quickly. The platoon commander shouted for the Navy SEALs to push up and break the ambush. Mark reloaded, wiped plastered dust from his face, and moved without waiting for an order. He slid along the wall, weapon up, eyes locked onto the rooftop where the PKM was now reloading. He could see the glint of the ammo belt, the silhouette of the gunner leaning behind cover. Mark fired again, controlled, precise, and forced the gunner to drop back. That tiny window of suppression let the rest of the assault element pour out of the building and get into alternate firing positions. It shattered the insurgents' perfect kill zone. But the fight was nowhere near over. As the SEALs split into 2 teams to flank the enemy, a new call came over the radio. One of the soldiers had taken a round during the opening burst. He was bleeding badly. Multiple medics rushed towards the wounded soldier's position to try to stabilize him, but the enemy realized it and immediately shifted fire toward the building where the wounded soldier was being treated. In an instant, the pressure on that building tripled, and Mark once again didn't hesitate. He sprinted across a debris-filled hallway, took up a firing stance at a blown-out window, and unleashed another volley, drawing the enemy's fire away from the medics inside and onto him. Rounds ripped past him yet again, glass shattered, fragments cut through his arms, but he stayed in the window and stayed firing. He stayed blocking the enemy's line of sight to the wounded man. This was Mark's second major stand of the day, the moment where he refused to move, refused to hide, and refused to give the enemy a single angle on his brothers. And once again, it worked. The team was able to stabilize the wounded soldier and prepare him for evacuation, but the enemy wasn't done yet. Insurgent fighters started maneuvering, moving across rooftops, creeping along alleys, trying to get elevation on the Americans. The fight was expanding in every direction, a 3-dimensional urban battle, and the only way to regain control was to take the high ground. The platoon commander gave the next order: "We're going to take the roof." Mark nodded, no hesitation once again. He knew exactly what that meant. They were about to climb straight into the teeth of the enemy's fire, and Mark would be the first one up the ladder. In urban combat, rooftops are everything. High ground means visibility. Visibility means control, but it also means exposure. Anyone up there became a silhouette, an easy target for every rifle, every PKM, every hidden shooter in the city. Mark knew that. Everyone did. But the wounded soldier inside the building needed to be evacuated. The enemy was closing in tight, and the only way to regain momentum was to put shooters above the insurgents and dominate the block from the top down. I'm sure you're beginning to see a pattern here, but again, without hesitation, Mark volunteered immediately. He grabbed the ladder frame, slung his rifle, and started climbing. Bullets were cracking overhead, slamming into the walls, punching chips of concrete onto the sills below. Enemy fighters had already maneuvered onto surrounding rooftops, waiting for the Americans to expose themselves again. But Mark climbed anyway. As he crested over the rooftop, he didn't hesitate. He didn't duck. He didn't crawl along the roof. He immediately got onto his feet and into the fight. The enemy opened up in an instant. Multiple muzzle flashes burst from 2 adjacent rooftops. A PKM down the block swung its barrel in his direction. An insurgent on a stairwell popped shots from a dark, shadowed doorframe. Mark planted his feet, squared up, and answered with controlled fire. Fast, accurate, and furious. He wasn't just returning fire, he was drowning it. Behind him, the rest of the SEALs were still climbing, bottlenecked on the ladder. If the enemy caught them halfway up, they'd be shot before they even reached the roof. Mark realized that and chose to make himself the biggest target for the enemy to protect his brothers on the ladder. He shifted to the left flank, firing at a rooftop gunner, sending tracers across the block. He then shifted to the right, cutting off another fighter trying to push to a firing position. Rounds snapped past him. One tore across the rooftop, sparking off a rusted air duct behind him, but he kept on shooting. Mike Mansour was the next man up, dropping into a supporting position, returning fire from a lower crouch. Mark pushed further into the open, absorbing the enemy's full focus. He called out enemy positions to his brothers as he continued to lay down fire. Every shot he fired bought seconds. Seconds for the medic team preparing the casualty downstairs, seconds for the SEALs behind him to get onto the roof and into cover, seconds that meant survival. survival. The enemy pressure intensified. More fighters poured into the fight, shifting buildings, crossing alleys, and coordinating fire in a way that showed they knew the terrain by heart. Mark adjusted his stance, rolled to another fighting position, and began suppressing a PKM team 3 buildings over. And that's when it happened. A single enemy round struck him during the exchange, a precise shot from one of the rooftop gunmen he'd been holding back. Mark collapsed where he stood, his weapon falling across his chest. The SEALs surged forward immediately. Mansour moved to cover him, others laying down blistering fire to keep the enemy back. But the damage was catastrophic. Mark had taken the brunt of the enemy's fire so others wouldn't have to, and in doing so, he had saved them. Below them, the wounded soldier was carried out to the evacuation point. Above, the Navy SEALs fought with a fury that pushed the insurgents back and secured the rooftops. The Americans survived that day because Mark Lee made a choice again and again to put himself between the enemy and his brothers. And he paid for it with everything he had. Mark Allen Lee became the first Navy SEAL killed in the Battle of Ramadi, but what he did in those final moments is why several of his brothers lived. When the fight was finally over, the smoke settled across the rooftops of Ramadi like a heavy curtain. Spent brass rolled in the dust, broken concrete crumbled under every boot step, and the SEALs gathered around the spot where their brother had made his last stand. They carried Mark Lee off that rooftop with the same intensity he had carried into the fight. Steady, deliberate, protective. Nobody spoke. There were no words big enough for that moment. The wounded soldier Mark had shielded survived. The men he drew fire away from also survived. And a platoon that would have been pinned down and cut apart lived because Mark refused to hide from an enemy intent on killing his brothers. The news spread fast through Task Unit Bruiser. Even in a place as violent as Ramadi, Mark's actions hit everyone hard. He wasn't just another operator, he was the teammate who cracked jokes in the Humvee, who pushed those around him in training, who shouldered the load without ever asking for anything back. He was the guy who stepped forward when others stepped back. The guy you trusted with your life. At his memorial service in Iraq, his teammates spoke about courage, real courage. Not the kind in movies, not the kind in stories, but the kind that happens in a split-second decision, under gunfire, when nobody is watching, and when the price is heavy. Mark Lee received the Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Valor, and the Purple Heart for his actions on August 2nd, 2006. But medals only tell part of the story. The rest is written in the lives he's saved, in the teammates who came home because he stood out in the open on their behalf, in the legacy he left behind, a legacy of service, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that defines the very best of the SEAL teams. Today, his name is spoken with absolute respect inside the community. His story is taught to new operators, and every year men and women from across the military honor him, not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. Mark Allen Lee was 28 years old, a brother, a warrior, a protector, and on a rooftop in Ramadi, he showed the world exactly what U.S. Navy SEALs are made of. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isaiah 41:10. This is your reminder to put your phone down, turn the TV off, read your Bible, and pray. There has probably never been a better time in history for us to pray. If you've never prayed before and you've never given your life to the Lord, now is the perfect time. All it takes is taking that first step of faith with one simple prayer. Romans 10 verse 9 says, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.